Hi everybody, it's Lauren. Welcome back to my channel. I am super excited for this video because today I'm going to be telling you about my top 5 feminist reads and the reasons why I think they're super feminist. I absolutely love it when we've got female characters who are developed just as well as the men in books. A couple of particular favorites are Hermione Granger and Annabeth Chase, but that's just me. And as we here on BookTube know, literature can be really influential, so it does shape the way that we think about women and the way that we value ourselves and value each other. So I chose these books because I think they have some really positive feminist messages in them. So in 5th place, we have The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. What? Thought this was a feminist video. What is a book about a guy doing here? Well, first of all, it is in 5th place, not like 2nd or 1st. Also, it's written by the absolutely marvelous Mackenzie Lee. And as is probably not a surprise, I'm going to be talking mostly about the one main female character in this book. So, if you're unfamiliar, The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue is a YA historical novel set somewhere in the 1800s, I believe. Early 1800s, I'm pretty sure. Why is the light so weird on my face right now? So basically it's about an English viscount named Monty who is desperately in love with his best friend Percy, who is also English nobility but tends to be ostracized because he's black. So the book follows Monty, Percy, and Monty's younger sister Felicity, who's in her mid to late teens, as they go on a tour of the continent, which is a term I was not familiar with until I read this book, but seems to mean visiting as many European cities as you possibly can in one trip. Seriously, the light is freaking me out. It's like half of my face is a ghost or something. Ooh. Just gonna move. Is that better? Yes, it is. Can't quite gesticulate the same way on this side of the camera. But back to The Gentleman's Guide. This book is one of the most social justice-y stories I have ever read. It tackles racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and while Monty himself is a fairly sexist and problematic character, the narrative does not condone the gross things that he does. He very often gets called out by his younger sister Felicity, who gets very in his face during this book, and she calls him out on his bullshit and his privilege when he doesn't consider the worst consequences that can happen to people who aren't white and male. So while he does suffer consequences, they're not nearly as severe as, say, a woman caught in an indecent act or Percy caught in an indecent act. Okay, we had a bit of a mishap with the camera, so that's why the angle is different. Where was I? Oh yeah, Felicity. Love her so much. She is maybe the absolute coolest Slytherin character I've ever met. Yeah, I totally sorted her into Slytherin. She's super smart and super resourceful and so ambitious. And she ends up being so helpful to getting Monty out of the trouble that he gets into. And there's something so cool about Felicity that I want to talk about, but you know what? I'm about to talk about Felicity with some spoilery stuff. So if you have not read the book and you want to read it without, knowing what's going to happen, I suggest you mute the video until the book vanishes. Okay, so Felicity wants to be a medical doctor, which is such an appropriate thing for a woman to be in the 1800s. And despite her status and wealth, she can't even get a proper education. Once they're finished with the continental tour, her parents are going to be shipping her off to finishing school, which sounds like death to her. But she does this really cool thing where she actually gets her hands on books about medicine and science, removes the covers and replaces them with the covers from romantic novels. So while her parents aren't totally thrilled that she's reading, and I'm quoting Monty here, smut, they would be a lot more horrified if they knew that she was actually reading anatomy. And man, I just absolutely think this is the coolest, trickiest thing she could have done. And when I found out that she did it in the book, I was just so delighted. Also, something I really appreciated about Felicity was, in addition to calling out Monty on his sexist bullshit along with other characters and standing up for herself and yada yada, when she finally finds out about Monty's feelings for Percy, she actually makes an effort to understand how her brother can possibly have romantic feelings for another guy. Like, it's not that she's automatically accepting, because this is a level of taboo that is just not quite applicable to the modern world. But the fact that she tries is such a huge thing for the 1800s. That's of course not to say that she's perfect. Felicity can definitely be too harsh and judgmental at times. And honestly, I've only read the book once, so I'm not really in a position to totally analyze her character right now. And also, I want to make clear that I'm just talking about the first book here. I am not considering her sequel that is completely dedicated to Felicity, which is The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy. But I really want to read it, and I'm psyched to do so when I finally get my hands on it. But my TBR pile is already so high and I don't have this book. And honestly, I kind of want to wait until I'm a little less hyped about it so that there's less of a chance that it'll let me down, you know? And in fourth place is The Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. Y'all didn't think you were gonna get through this video without me talking about my favorite dragon scientist, did you? Like me make a video about feminism without a natural history of dragons. Not happening. So even though I've only read the first 2 of these 5 books, A Natural History of Dragons and The Tropic of Serpents, it is already one of my favorite series of all time. It's a fantasy series that has kind of a historical fiction flavor. It's basically set in an alternate Earth that looks very similar to ours, like Regency, early industrial era. And our leading lady, Isabella, grew up in their equivalent of England. Isabella defies all the odds and becomes a renowned dragon naturalist, having gone on a lot of scandalous expeditions to study them. And these books are written as Isabella's memoirs about her early work. So, probably pretty clear why I included this on this list. Isabella totally smashes her gender expectations and steps out of that traditional role to do what she's passionate about, which is dragons. She'd been like obsessed with animals since she was a little kid, and she had shown that kind of curious, adventurous spirit as a child. But the thing is that she's not exactly a steamrolling maverick. Isabella is very much her own well-developed character. Her personality isn't very well suited to her traditional gender role, but she actually does try really hard to fulfill her duties as a daughter and a wife and eventually a mother. She's not cavalier about her family and how her actions affect them. And even though she's a noblewoman who becomes this kind of scandalous figure in her society, you can't quite separate her from her upbringing, from her culture. And I really like that, because I don't like it when it's portrayed as kind of easy and natural to just completely break away from the environment that you grew up in, for better or for worse. And I'd argue that there's a mix here. How she was raised shaped her. So like I said, she doesn't exactly smash through every barrier between her and studying dragons. She more faces down and gracefully sidesteps the obstacles. Isabella is a very proud woman, and in her early adulthood, she faces a lot of trouble trying to build her own identity as a woman, not to mention a naturalist doing groundbreaking research. The biggest component of these books is definitely the dragons. It's a little bit like, not quite like watching a nature documentary, but it really is. There's a lot about the dragons themselves and their habitats and their behavior and the general ecology and physiology of the dragons she studies. So as someone who's like a little bit of a bio nerd, I really appreciate that. But that's not the whole thing. Obviously, there's a good deal of character development and politics, because that's what happens when there's good world building. There's also a fair amount of romance, because like I said, she does get married. And I'm not going to tell you her husband's name, because that would kind of give away who she ends up getting with, because early in the first book, there is her whole finding a husband montage. Not exactly a montage, but you know what I mean. It was a sequence. But I do absolutely love the man that she ends up marrying. He's like a little bit on the unorthodox side himself, and I just think they have such a beautiful relationship. They did kind of marry for convenience, but they genuinely like each other. And he supports Isabella in her endeavors, not without trepidation, but ultimately he thinks that his job as a husband is not to be in charge of everything, but to have his wife be happy. And that just made me so happy, especially since she does so much for him. So that relationship does end up being quite reciprocal and healthy. And oh, it's just so romantic. My kind of romance, at least. Loving the time of dragons. So, woman in her early 20s breaks out of her gender role and becomes a scientist. Boom. One of the greatest books ever. Now in spot number 3, we have Graceling by Kristen Cashore. I think it's telling that so far all of the authors have been women. So Graceling only beat out the Memoirs of Lady Trent by like a little bit. To me, they're kind of on even ground with the feminism stuff. I mean, I think the Dragon series is like slightly better in quality, but that's not what I'm judging right now. So this is somewhat of an older one, but Graceling is yet another fantasy novel. And unlike the Dragon one, it's set in a world that like isn't recognizable to us. It's not meant to be similarly structured to ours. The stuff that happens is a little bit more like medieval Europe, you know, pretty standard fantasy stuff. So we've got a bunch of kingdoms with corrupt monarchs and they all kind of hate each other. But I really do like subtle fantasy, which I think the Graceling Realm trilogy does really well. I am getting off track. I'm supposed to be talking about feminism. So all 3 books in the Graceling trilogy, each installment is about a different character, each one a unique and strong woman in her own right. We've got Graceling, Fire, and then Bitterblue. But Graceling is the one that I am most familiar with because it's the one that I've reread the most number of times. So this is the one I'm going to be talking about. So our main character is Katza, who is in her late teens, I think. And she is a Graceling, meaning that she has been born with a very specific, very extreme skill, you know, something that she's just a complete natural at. And there are a whole broad variety of graces, like just like think of anything you can be good at and there's probably a grace for that. Now, Katza's is killing people. So in most of the kingdoms, Gracelings, once they're discovered to be Gracelings, become the legal property of the king. So when her king finds out, who is also her uncle, he does the truly despicable thing and raises her to be his personal thug and executioner. So this is already fantastic because we've got a character who has done some pretty horrible things, but she was strong-armed into it, and oh, that's great for a character crisis. So for Katza, her story is mostly about demanding her freedom. She actually has her own sense of justice, and as she gets older and older, she feels more and more constrained by the obviously abusive environment that she's in. So she's forced to do these things that are reprehensible to her own personal moral compass, but at the same time, she doesn't feel like she can break free from her uncle's control. She is, in my opinion, a very well-rounded character, and she has some interesting character development. What she does with her freedom is not just like go gallivanting like I can do whatever I want, I'm free, which like I would totally understand if she had done that. But instead, what really triggers this is she wants to be free so she can do what's right. She actually kind of reminds me of Mulan a little bit in this because she doesn't break out of her established role in society purely for the sake of breaking out of that role, but because the constraints of that role are keeping her from doing what she feels in her gut is right. And that's kind of where the similarities stop, because otherwise her character is not like Mulan. Katza is very impatient and a little temperamental and definitely hot-headed. She's kind of a natural crusader and I love it. My one complaint with this book, as well as the 2 previous ones that I talked about, is that there aren't an abundance of female relationships in here. There's like plenty of nuanced and complicated relationships between the protagonist and other men. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I just wish that there had been more female characters so we could get a bit more of a diversity of personalities. I think Katza is amazing because she's very individual and she's very intense, and she only represents one version of what a free, independent woman can be. In her case, it's very, very tomboy. And just seeing positive relationships between women is so important for feminism, and I do wish that that was a little bit more in this book. But since a lot of this story is a romance developing between her and a different character, it does kind of make sense that most of the focus is on her relationship with this one other man. I'm just saying, that's like my one thing. And now moving on to number 2, second place, we have, and this really, if you're familiar with my channel, should surprise nobody, Failure to Communicate by Kaya Sonderby. Finally, we've got something that's not fantasy. We've got science fiction. I have a type. So Failure to Communicate is something of a space opera. Is it considered a space opera if a lot of the plot takes place on planets, but then a lot of it also takes place on spaceships? Whatever. It's set 4,000 years in the future and in space and on foreign planets. The world building honestly feels like a bit of a cross between Star Trek and Star Wars, and I mean that in the absolute best way. Essentially, the human race is now in this coalition with a bunch of other intelligent alien races. The main character is a woman in her late 20s named Xandri Coralel, and she is possibly the only autistic person in the universe because yay, Xandri is a very skilled Xeno liaison, so most of the book is her genetic engineering piece with this really difficult and very xenophobic society. And so like most of the story is political intrigue. Failure to Communicate is great on representation. Xandri herself is 3-dimensional in a way that I rarely see in book characters. Oh my God. She just has such incredible depth. Essentially, if I had to boil her down to something, she is a very curious and very naturally kind person who has been through so much bullshit in her life that she's developed a very salty exterior. She has a fair amount of antagonistic relationships and a fair amount of positive, healthy relationships. One of these is my absolute favorite and a reason that this is so high up on this list. Captain Shui Feng is kind of a mentor to Xandri. She is absolutely invested in her growth. From my perspective, she's kind of like the coolest teacher, aunt, and mom combination for Xandri that she like never had. She's just like Xandri's ultimate role model, and they have a very close and very honest relationship. So that friendship is so important to me. If any of y'all watch Star Trek Discovery, think a little bit Captain Georgiou and Michael Burnham. I mean the original Georgiou, guys, not the other one. So the number one reason you should read this book is absolutely the character development and the representation, because I think representation is part of character development. And the number 2 reason is definitely the world building. Holy cow, I love the world building. Is it universe building if it's not a single planet? But moving on to number 1 on the list, we're back to fantasy. And thus far, of the books that I have read in my life, in my own personal opinion, the most feminist one is Princess Academy by Shannon Hale. Wow, okay, yeah, all 5 of these books were written by women. Who'da thunk? This is also the only middle grade novel on here, and it makes me feel kind of reassured for kids who are being raised, although when it's an older book, so I read it when I was in middle grade, so it's got kind of a special place in my heart. Basically, this is set in a mining village in the mountains where the king of the lands, I don't really remember what it's called, Danland, that's what it's called, Danland. So the royal priests or prophets or something declare that the next princess of Danland is going to be coming from this particular village in the mountains. So the royal family sends a tutor up to the village to educate all of the girls who are of about the appropriate age, generally a teenager. I think the range was 12 to 17. So they're all taken to an academy to be educated. And when the time comes, the prince is going to come visit the academy where there's going to be a ball, and he's going to choose among the girls which one he wants to marry. So progressive, right? So here's the thing. The beauty in this book is absolutely rooted in the relationships. The main character, her name is Mary. She is 14 years old, and obviously she's one of the girls who's sent to the academy. And the tutor that they send basically tries to pit the girls against each other to like foster competition, and it works for a while. So there is an element of the cattiness that tends to accompany fictional teenage girls. But the thing is that in this story, it's resolved. Friendships are made, friendships are repaired. It's absolutely beautiful. The girls find some really good solidarity when they absolutely need it from each other. So those positive and complex relationships between young girls, I think, is something that we really need to be showing kids more of. This was such a positive influence on my life, and it shows how girls who kind of dislike each other and don't get along can still respect each other, and how girls who are very different can still become close. Every single character has their own ambitions, and almost none of them is marrying the handsome prince. For some, it's getting a better education. For some, it is getting off the mountain and seeing the rest of the kingdom. For some, they really just want to go back home and work in the quarry with their parents. Something I absolutely appreciate is the fundamental culture of the village that this is set in that it's not sexist. All the girls and all the boys have to be useful to the village. They have to participate and contribute somehow. And if for whatever reason they can't mine, they find something else to do, the girls of the village are not valued less than the boys when it comes to the social constructs in their community. Personally, Mary has a little bit of a Hermione appeal to me, because once she is taught how to read, she finds out that she loves reading, she loves learning, so she becomes a little bit of a brainiac. And obviously, any character who is passionate about books to any degree is one I'm going to relate to. Is there anything else I want to say about this book? It has 2 sequels. When I read it, it was a standalone. I've read the second one and I own, but haven't gotten to the third one. If you're an adult, this might not be the most appealing novel to read because it is middle grade. It's written for 12-year-olds. But if you don't mind books that are geared at a younger audience, or you have children in your life that you think could benefit from this book, I highly, highly recommend. Although, to be fair, I personally read it when I was very young, and it was very formative for my own development, so it holds a deeply special place in my heart. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been my favorite feminist fiction. As I read more books, I am absolutely certain that this list will change, but from the ones that I have read so far in my life, these are the ones that take the cake. I've been a little bit absent from BookTube this month, and I am not happy about it. I miss making these videos and I miss interacting with the community. It's April. I'm in college. It's finals, papers, you get it. So did you guys agree with my choices? Is there anything you just want to say about these books, add to the conversation, or if there's fiction that you think I left out and really should read, please let me know in the comments. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you really enjoyed this video, please do hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.